Morten, your accent is reassuring these days. We've been watching so much Danish television during the lockdown. Uh-oh, you're also on mute, so now I don't hear your accent.
And he doesn't have the subtitles, like the series.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Andrea.
Hi, Maria. Hi, Morten.
Andrea, how are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for accepting to share this, Maria.
My pleasure.
Hey, Andrea.
Should I just say a super brief CPR welcome before we start? Okay.
We don't have a CEPR background.
Oh,
yeah.
Just look at Bob with MIT background here.
And it's physical, right? It's not.
Oh, wow!
That's pro.
That way you move your head and you don't disappear. So,
but Andrea, you have, because Daniel has this with Columbia background, and then it says his, her, him. You know, it says the gender that you want to prefer on the screen.
My background is virtual. It's actually amazing. It looks like I'm writing on it.
Andrea, are you teaching? And if so, do you use anything like that to write on?
I do hybrid, so it's a mess. You have to wear a mask when you teach. It's a mess.
And this is the MBAs or the PhDs?
So far, only PhDs, but I'm gonna have to deal with 130 executive MBA people hybrid in 3 parallel classes, and the teacher is jumping from one class to the other one.
By day?
Well,
jumping each day?
Actually, they would prefer us to do it in the same, so it's 3 hours, and they would like us to do 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour. It sounds like a technological nightmare.
Wow.
But yeah, you instead, you're all virtual, right?
I am, and the econ are, but a bunch of the others are closer to your situation.
Let's see. By the way, Bob, I will apologize again in person. I will need to leave in about half an hour because I'm giving a talk elsewhere at Northwestern.
As long as you take less than half the audience with you, I'm okay. Speaking of whom, I wonder if I have co-authors on this call. Let's find out.
So I'm here.
Hi, Christian.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Christian.
And Holger's here. That's good.
And
I'm here too.
Waving, yeah.
And Manuel. Great, great, great.
So the chat is going to have all the action.
Their role is to tamp it down so that it doesn't get carried away. Yeah.
So it's actually 12:01. Shall we get started? So I'll first do a very quick introduction, then Maria sets the rules of the game, and then Bob goes. So my main role here is to say a big thank you again to Morten Bennetsen for this initiative. I think it's an amazing initiative. We did it before the summer, and now we're starting again with a lower frequency once a month, because we realize that everybody has other commitments, but we think it's very important to continue. And a huge thank you to CEPR for making this possible, and in particular to Mandy Chan, who's been helping us so much. So. And also a big thank you to Bob for accepting to do this first fall talk, and for Maria Guadalupe for chairing this. So Maria, on to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I won't take much since we all want to hear Bob talk. Bob needs no introduction. We all know him. He's an accomplished theorist. And the one thing I'd mention, also to thank him publicly on this, is because I think he's one of the most impressive institution builders that I've come across in this profession. He's been through the NBR, CO, and many other venues building the field and pushing it and being tirelessly and very generously giving his time. So thank you, Bob. So the paper now, as it goes from theories, he has has been generating data through field experiments, and we're looking forward to hearing more on this. In terms of how we run this, there'll be 2 breaks. So we'll open the floor for questions. The chat is open, and 3 co-authors are here. So Manuel, Holger, and Christian are all here. And we'll go for an hour, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for free Q&A. So the floor is yours, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea and Morten and Maria, and special thanks to Manuel, Holger, and Christian for not only answering all the hard questions, but doing all the hard work on this paper too. So let's see if I can run the technology here. Christian, did it move slides for you? No.
For the moment, I only see black, actually.
Oh, well, good thing we're testing this then. Just one second. Now let's try again. Yes, I may have done this in the wrong order. How about now? What do you see? Much better.
Activation. Good.
Okay. So there we go. Let's try that again. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This project is called Building an Equilibrium. We study rules versus principles in relational contracts. So this paper is trying to be about what we call in our group and a little bit beyond Sunday night. I think any real relationship in the world, especially, let's say, a contractual relationship between 2 firms or various other things, if the productive aspects of that relationship were going to start on Monday morning, surely the parties would have a beer on some previous day, say Sunday night, and talk about what does success look like in this collaboration we're about to launch together. So, you know, all the models of relational contracts that I know, including every single one that I'm a co-author on, ignores Sunday night. It imagines that we're in equilibrium from the beginning. And if there are shocks, we stay in equilibrium after them, and we anticipated them and in effect talked about them, or anyway reached agreement about them, because equilibrium is reaching agreement. And so this literature has focused on what Rebecca Henderson and I call the credibility problem that you're all familiar with. Should I believe the promise I think you're making to me? When in fact, Sunday night is all about a next door problem, complementary problem that we call the clarity problem. Do we have a shared understanding of the promise that you're making to me? And so, you know, the games that at least I write down, especially in class, hugely cheat. I mean, they even label the moves honor and betray in a trust game. Whereas in fact, you know, the interesting cases are those where what constitutes honor or betray, what constitutes cooperation or defection, depends in part on circumstances and can't be cleanly defined in advance, and So that's what we're trying to explore here. And the way we're going to do this is in an experiment. It's a trading game in particular. So you see Christian's nice diagram of money for something. Christian, what is that? A box. We're buying boxes here or something? Yeah. And so this trading game has a first phase that's very simple, and then which is finite horizon, known to be 5 periods. And then at the right end here, you see the second phase, which is a repeated game with random stopping. And the point of this exercise is that there's a shock here in the next to right phase where something changes, the parameters or a little bit of the structure or however you want to think about it. We'll get back to that in a minute. And so I suppose the shock is, you know, I'm sure there are experiments with shocks in them. What may be slightly more unusual is that we're going to ask the participants before they see the shock about various scenarios that could occur. And that's going to be important in what we do. And as well, we start with, as you may have guessed, given the non-centering of the previous figure, we start with Sunday night. So this experiment starts with a chat and an attempt to reach some informal agreement. And then the questions that we ask them in the scenario studies in the middle here are about, what do you think the agreement wants you to do? Will you do it? What do you expect the other to do? And questions like that. Okay, so our notion is that based on a whole bunch of case studies, actually, that one gets in trouble where either things are explicitly stated as specific rules, or they're implicitly constant based on current circumstances. And then when the circumstances change a lot, all of a sudden the behaviors that were appropriate in the original circumstances are viewed by at least one party as no longer appropriate in the new circumstances. And so what might work better than a specific rule is perhaps a principle, like do the efficient thing and divide it fairly, which is maybe not fully specified, but fairly relative to what. But anyway, that's the beginnings of something like a principle as opposed to a specific rule. And so we do this in the lab for a couple reasons. One is, the usual, we can randomly assign the subjects, but we can also control the future. We can put in this shock, which is very important for us. That's the fourth stage of the 5 that I showed. And then we can also ask them, not just, we can measure what they do choose to do in the lab, but we can ask them what they expect to do, what they expect others to do, what they think this agreement calls on them to do in the current circumstances, and so on. So to preview our findings so that we can, I think, have a richer discussion as we go along, in our first baseline condition, data collection in the lab, if you will, no treatment yet, what we find is that pairs that we code by text analyzing their chat and their agreement, pairs that we code as coming up with principles outperform those that we code as coming up with rules post-shock. So they chat pre-shock, we ask them our questions pre-shock, then the shock happens, and then the performance measure of interest to us is post-shock. So that was exactly what we hoped for. And then we set out to say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could induce exogenous variation in principles? What if we could help some new sets of dyads improve by nudging them, as you'll see, towards thinking about principles? And what we find is a whole lot of things that look like principles, some improvements in behavior, but in ways that we'll describe, not enough. And you can think of it as an interaction effect, right? What we're gonna diagnose in the baseline condition is that the dyads with principles are really doing better in a couple of ways that are like an interaction effect, and you need to do them all. And what happened with the nudge was more principles, all right, but not every component of the interaction effect, and hence in the end, no better performance. And at first, I'll come clean. I hope it's okay with my co-authors that I come clean. I think actually they feel the same. At first, we were disappointed. We said, oh, rats, this should have worked. But then we thought a little bit, and if it were as easy as this very light touch intervention, this nudge, 3 sentences, as you'll see, to improve performance of dyads, well then, that kind of wrecks the literature that lots of us have been participating in, which imagines that it's hard to build an equilibrium, hard to define and refine an efficient relational contract. And that idea is not new to us. It's, for example, present in Jay Barney's work on could organizational culture be a competitive advantage? And so if you add a little David Krebs on organizational culture as a repeated game equilibrium, you can put Barney and Krebs together and say, Barney said organizational culture better be hard to imitate if it's going to convey competitive advantage. And likewise with the Krebs part, building an equilibrium, building a relational contract better be hard if it too is gonna create competitive advantage. And what we found was, even in this pretty simple setting in the lab, the intervention that we did wasn't enough. And so we've turned this into a half full view where we think that's an important message. Okay, so of course there's a large literature on relational contracts in theory, and I love where this literature is going. Most recently, to look at learning and adaptation, which I take to be monumentally important things to think about. And yet those three papers, Shasang, Andres and Barron, and Lee et al., are in equilibrium from the beginning, as essentially all of the work is. And so that's the piece of the analysis we're trying to loosen in this lab setting. Of course, there are a bunch of different strands of experimental economics that are relevant. I think given time, I'll skip over the details and move straight to this last bucket that, as far as I know, has two very nice recent papers in it that think of themselves as combining formal and relational contracts, but the way in which they mean that is a little different than you might have thought. Here what happens is the decision-making and the rewards and punishment and so on are still relational. The formal part is building a formal governance structure, like a governance committee just to have oversight and so on. And so it isn't, a formal pay plan plus a relational pay plan. It's a formal governance structure plus a relational contract. And so those papers, as far as I know, aren't modeling or analyzing Sunday night exactly, but they sure are setting up forums in which, first of all, Sunday night type discussions could happen. And second of all, we didn't put a day of the week on when does our shock happen in our laboratory setting, but suppose it happens on Wednesday. Well, then Wednesday night or Thursday morning, we're going to need another forum, another beer or a coffee or something to figure out, okay, the sentence that I would really like to see in this literature, whether it's the experimental literature or the theoretical literature or both, is the thought sentence in some participant's head: did we miscommunicate, or am I being gamed? And that's the clarity problem and the credibility problem put together. And what this last literature on real formal plus relational contracts does is, the way I interpret it anyway, is create these forums where people can have that kind of discussion. Okay, I'm almost ready for our first break, but let me talk through, since we don't know a theory that is not in equilibrium yet, we developed this little conceptual framework that talks about the various ingredients in our laboratory setting, the agreement before the shock, and then not just the behaviors, but also the beliefs after the shock. So again, it's a trading game between a buyer and a seller. Conveniently, I'm going to think of those as American baseball caps they have on there. So we have buyer B and seller S. The buyer's choosing a price, and Q is a quality, not a quantity, it's a quality. So that's a gift to the buyer if the seller chooses a higher quality, just like a price is a gift to the seller if the buyer chooses a higher price. And so there's our trading game. And at the beginning of our experiment, they chat and they may reach an agreement and write it down. And from that agreement, let's imagine that each party distills some notion of what should happen, a normative idea. That's the superscript N. So the buyer has an idea of what price should be offered and what quality should be supplied. And the seller has a potentially different notion of what price should be paid and what quality should be provided. Oop, wrong way, sorry. And so a first question is, do they agree? Did they reach normative consensus in this discussion? And then we ask, okay, it's all well and good if they reached a consensus about what should happen, but do they actually do it? And so we look at this person by person. On the left, we talk about, it's kind of a mouthful, normative behavioral consistency for the buyer. Does the buyer do what the buyer thinks the agreement calls for? And likewise on the right, does the seller do what the seller thinks that the agreement calls for? And only after those two steps do we work our way towards the question of equilibration. And so here, the little clouds with the hat objects in them Q hat B is, of course, the buyer's conjecture about the quality that the seller will provide. And P hat S is the seller's conjecture about the price that the buyer will pay. And then we impose a, here, slightly weak definition of equilibrium, since again, P and Q are gifts. If you overperform, that's okay. So we're just asked, we're going to call it equilibrated here if the counterparty delivers at least as much as the party was expecting. The price higher than P hat and a quality higher than Q hat. Okay, so that's our conceptual framework, and relative to our timeline here, the way we're going to think about this is we're going to text analyze their chat and agreement and decide whether it looks more like a rule or more like a principle. And then after they do their first phase, known finite horizon, simple setting of trading, we're going to ask them questions about 3 possible scenarios that could arise. And they've been tutored from the very beginning before they got into the chat. It's been explained to them, of course, in the usual way of experiments. Here's what's going to happen to you in this experiment. And in particular, it's been explained to them that the world will change, that you're going to see trading phase 1, and that after that 5 periods, the world will change in some way that we're not now describing. And so we're going to use these questions before the shock happens to evaluate first the red normative consensus. Did they agree on what should happen? Second, because we're one of the 3 scenarios is going to be the one that happens. And in any case, they therefore list what they would do in each of those 3 situations, scenarios. And as a result, we can evaluate, given what the person told us they thought the normative implications of the agreement were, is their choice in that scenario consistent with that normative stance? And then at the dyad level, again, we ask, are they equilibrated in the weak inequality sense that I described before? So we'll construct these 3 measures in the middle, and then we'll look at what happens when they actually get into the shocked repeated game. Okay, I think I am ready to pause and take questions.
So the chat is quiet. There's no questions being asked. So you were very clear. So if anybody has a question, just unmute yourself and ask. And if it gets crazy, I'll put a bit of order. But I think let's try this first. Any questions for Bob?
Can I ask Bob a question?
Go ahead.
John here. Hi, Bob.
Hi, John.
Hi. I mean, quick question. What are you randomizing over? What's the randomization? Is the shock?
So no, so far I've told you only about the baseline. Sorry for my poor exposition of experiments due to lack of experience there. I'm just telling you our little machine for gathering data. The treatment is going to come next, and it's very light touch, seemingly too light touch. What's going to happen is we're going to take a new cohort of participants and add at the very beginning, just as they go into their chat, remember, we told you that the world's going to change.
Okay, that's your nudge.
That's our nudge.
Okay, okay. So you can postpone this question completely until later. But if I've understood one of the results seems to be that if I can form an agreement on Sunday night, let's say, and maybe also you'll tell me later if this is norm consistent or something, that when the shock happens, I perform better if I form the agreement and got the consensus and if I happens. Is that
almost? By and large, I'll oversimplify a little. Let's say they all form agreements on Sunday night. What we're interested in is a qualitative property of that agreement. Is it more like a rule? And in a minute, I'll show you the trading game. And it'll turn out in the trading game that a quality of 10 is efficient and a price of 70 splits the difference relative to outside options. And so having looked at that game, it might be that a rule, a very specific rule in the way we're using the term would be, you should always choose a quality of 10 and you should always pay a price of 70. Whereas a principle, right? So there are 2 kinds of agreements they could reach on Sunday night. One that's in our sense too specific because it's rooted in the current circumstances, and another that would yield the same answer in those current circumstances, but has legs, if you will, right? It's applicable to some new situation, like, why don't we choose the efficient quality and choose a price that splits the gains from exchange relative to outside options? Okay, so that's the difference that we're tracking, not so much whether they reach an agreement on Sunday night, but what kind of agreement.
I see. So my comment, and again, this was just, it's always tricky. It doesn't sound like you've done this. You're getting heterogeneity of the effect of the shock depending on the type of agreement you've reached. But the type of the agreement or the type of agreement you reached could be correlated with lots of other characteristics about the people making it. They might be smarter or better educated, or so it may be nothing specifically to do with the fact they made an agreement, but some other thing correlated with that agreement.
Absolutely right. But again, and I think if by the time we get to the next block of questions, this I hope will be clearer, but I whizzed by it perhaps too quickly in this first pass. Everything you said is 1000% correct about our we haven't done an experiment yet baseline condition. That baseline condition is just data collection in the lab. It's subject to omitted variables of exactly the kind you described. We are headed for a second condition with nudge, and it's the comparison between those two that we're interested in. So that heterogeneity about how smarter, I mean, we talk about, boy, that dyad 32, they have real trouble. Who knows what they were thinking, right? That kind of heterogeneity is very much inside our baseline condition. It's very much inside our nudge condition. And we're going to compare the difference in the averages between those two conditions at the end of the day. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Great. Maria, how are we doing?
I think you can maybe move on since there's not a lot of questions now, and things will become clear as they go. So keep going, and we'll have a bit more time.
I'm going to not dare look at the chat because I'm sure it'll mess up my screen sharing, but with 3 excellent co-authors on the job, I bet we're fine. Okay. So, and John, yeah, maybe this would have helped. Sorry, maybe I paused too early. Very simple trading environment, at least at first. As I said, quality Q is a gift to the buyer, and price P is a gift to the seller. And given the cost function that's shown here, the quality 10 is efficient, and 70 is an equal split of the rents created by that quality. And then we show them 3 different scenarios. So one has a higher value on Q, it was 10 before here, and unequal outside options. Another one has a fluctuating 10, and a third one differs in another way. And then we ask them the kinds of questions that I described as leading to our ability to then assess in a particular scenario. So, we ask them what quality should the seller provide, what price should the buyer pay in scenario 2, let's say. We ask them in all 3 scenarios. And then also what quality do you expect the seller to provide, expect the buyer to pay, and what will you choose? And those are incentivized as well. And indeed, it's scenario 1 that's going to happen, and that one in particular is going to be in the actual performance data. But the main point here is we ask them the things that allow us to assess, do they have a shared understanding of what should be done? Normative consensus, 1. Do individuals do what they think the agreement asks them to do? That's an individual level measure. And then equilibration. Are they doing things that are at least as good as the other party expected them to do? What happened to my cursor here? Yeah. There we go. Okay, good. So again, Professor Van Reenen, no experiment here as of yet, all right? This is data collection in the lab. All the heterogeneity you described is running around inside here. And we find it very interesting, and that takes us to our experiment, which is to add the second condition with the nudge. So these are absolutely endogenous agreement types and so on. So based on the coding of the chat and agreement, the blue here are the dyads that reached a principle on Sunday night, phase 1 of this baseline condition. And the red data are for those who reached only a rule. So first of all, the principles are fairly rare. Only 30% of the data, 30% of the pairs endogenously got to a PBA, principle-based agreement, but they do much better. Okay, the blue curve is higher than the red curve. That's the most careful empirical statement that I will make in this presentation, but all the careful ones are due to Manuel, Holger, and Christian. Okay, so now we're gonna play with and explore these endogenous data within this one baseline condition, no experiment yet. And so what you see here in rows, if you will, are the dyads that generated rules for their agreements. And lilac or something are the dyads that generated principles for their agreements. And what's on the x-axis are, recall, there are 3 scenarios we asked them about. And so we jump all the way to our third measure, the green equilibrated measure. And in fact, we ask a little bit more. Not only are they equilibrated, P bigger than P hat, Q bigger than Q hat, are they efficiently equilibrated, which means did they also get to Q equals 10, which is whatever is efficient in the scenario they're looking at. And so this score, the number of efficiently equilibrated scenarios, can be 0, 1, 2, or 3. Okay, and what you see is a first point is that the dyads that got to principles are equilibrated in more scenarios than are the dyads that had only rules. And then now on the y-axis on the right-hand side, we've put in performance. And so now we're showing average performance in that 5th phase of the data collection in the lab, the trading game with the new shocked parameters that has a random stopping time. And so what we're seeing here, not surprisingly, is first of all, in the black long run performance line with dots, regardless of whether you had a rule or a principle on Sunday night, the more equilibrated you are, the more scenarios you agree on, the better you do. Okay, and then that's correlated, as you can see, back to the lilac and the rose. You're more likely to be highly equilibrated if you had a principle rather than a rule. Okay, but let me reemphasize, that's pre-shock equilibration, predicting post-shock performance, subject to exactly the kind of dyad heterogeneity that John was describing. Okay, so now what's the relationship between equilibration and the other 2 concepts that we described? Do they have a shared understanding of what the agreement requires from them? Do they have a normative consensus? And in particular, do they have the efficient quality in that normative consensus? Yes or no? That was our first construct. That was in red. Second, do the parties say that they will do? In fact, do they choose? Those are incentivized choices. Do they choose to do the thing that the agreement, that they say the agreement asks them to do? Yes or no? And what we find here is that equilibration essentially doesn't happen, 2% of the time, 9% of the time, 8% of the time, unless you have both efficient normative, you can take out the word efficient everywhere or put it in everywhere, and sometimes I'll make a mistake and put it in only half the time, my apologies, but efficient equilibration essentially doesn't happen unless you have both efficient normative consensus and also at the individual level, normative behavioral consistency for both parties. Okay, so that's the sense in which these red and blue concepts are building blocks for equilibration, and that's going to be important when we get to the nudge that John's asking us for. But before we get there, let's just show you how this data collection in the lab, baseline condition, heterogeneous dyads data looks. Yes, the dyads that have a principle on Sunday night, rows, are more likely to be equilibrated than or efficiently equilibrated than are those that have only a rule. And the difference comes not so much from this difference in do they have a shared understanding of what the agreement asks them to do. It's, close, but not significant. But it comes a lot in, are they willing to do it? Okay, so this difference in, do I do what I take the agreement to ask me to do is huge here. And as we showed on the previous picture, you need both of these to get to efficient equilibration. And so we see this willingness to deliver on your part of the agreement as a key part of the story here. Okay, so this is the end of the baseline, right? We code up their Sunday night, rule versus principle. We measure, did they have a shared understanding of what the agreement asked them to do? And do they choose to do it? And as a result, are they in equilibrium or not? And as a function of those things, how do they do in the new shocked random stopping time repeated game? And so now comes the part John was asking for. And here it is. It's only a tiny little variation. It's that little nudge right there, Professor Van Reenen, right? And here it is. Here's our 3-sentence nudge. So all we do, and maybe with 2020 hindsight, you're going to tell us, well, yeah, this was a very weak nudge. No wonder it didn't exactly work. It kind of worked, and we want to unpack exactly how, but it's a very weak nudge, right? We just give them these 3 sentences during the chat. Okay, before you go off and write your agreement, effectively remember that the world's going to change. Okay, so what do we find? Well, first, the coders look at the agreements in the second condition, the nudge condition, the treatment condition, and they say, wow, there are a lot of principles in there. Okay, it used to be 30% of the dyads in the baseline condition had principles. Now it's 85. Okay, so you got principles all over everywhere. So that's a manipulation check, if you will, right? If we didn't generate that, then we did something wrong. However, when you look at performance, here on the left is, in a sense, the non-result that we've come to like, in the sense that long-run performance in the post-shock random stopping time repeated game is not higher in the nudge treatment as a whole. Okay, so John, I am not we're using 2 new colors on purpose here, right? I am here distinguishing between green and yellow, which are the baseline condition and the nudge treatment condition, inside of both of which are a bunch of rules and a bunch of principles. So we are no longer, at least in this slide, differentiating within condition between agreement types. Now, let's unpack a little bit. So having said that, at the level of the dependent variable of most interest, long-run performance, now let me go exploring inside conditions again and report the following. So what we showed you in the baseline data was that the performance of those dyads with rules was less good. That's this green, middle green bar, was less good than those dyads in the baseline condition that got to principles on Sunday night. And now, yeah, look at this. Way to go, guys. We've managed to lower them both, right? We have a lower long-run performance of the dyads that wrote rules in the new nudge treatment condition, and a lower long-run performance of the dyads that wrote principles in the new nudge treatment condition. And you go, well, how's that? Because this thing went up over here. And the answer, of course, is that the proportions are wildly different, right? So there are very few, only 15% of dyads in the nudge treatment wrote a rule, and they're truly terrible. And 85% wrote principles, and they're doing worse on average than the much smaller 30% that wrote principles in the unnudged baseline condition, which, we interpret, frankly, along John's line, right? That these are the dyads that got it at first, and we've now taken a bunch who couldn't quite get it figured out and perhaps moved them over, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so now let's unpack not just performance, right? This previous graph was of our longest run and perhaps most important outcome measure, but it doesn't tell you very much about how and why things are happening. It just tells you what's happening. And the answer at the experimental level, just comparing treatment and control, nudge versus baseline, is nothing's happening. Those are statistically the same. And so now we want to unpack the determinants of equilibration that we found in the baseline condition, which were, did they have a shared understanding of what should be done? Did they have a willingness to do what they should be done, what they attest the agreement calls on them to do? And as a result, as a pair, do they wind up not only equilibrated, but efficiently equilibrated? And so consistent with the idea that there's no difference in performance, all of these pictures have performance on the y-axis. What we show, if you jump all the way out to the right here in this next slide, is there's also no statistical difference in efficient equilibration. There's also no difference in normative consensus. What does the agreement call upon us to do? But quite importantly, we think the nudge did something. What you see here is that, and here is this, John, straight up, treatment green, control baseline green, nudge treatment yellow. And inside of each of those, plenty of heterogeneity like you're talking about, is a statistically significant effect on being willing to do what the agreement calls upon you to do. Okay, or at least what you think the agreement calls upon you to do. Okay, so nearing the end here. Now let's unpack that into quality versus price. So we can ask all those questions separately. Do they have a shared understanding of what the agreement calls on the seller to do as far as quality? Is the seller willing to do that? And given what the seller eventually does, is it consistent with what the buyer expected, which might or might not be what the buyer thought the agreement called upon the seller to do? And likewise on the right for price, do they have a shared understanding of what price the buyer is supposed to pay? Is the buyer actually going to do it? Is the buyer going to do what the buyer thinks the buyer is called upon to do in the agreement? And again, the seller's expectation of what the buyer is going to do might or might not be the same as what the seller thinks the agreement calls upon the buyer to do. But our notion of equilibration is whatever the seller's expectation is, does the buyer at least meet it? And as you walk through these, you see two significant effects over here for quality, but much more difficulty on price. And we conclude and show you one more slide to support the idea that that's actually where a lot of the issue is. I say that and interrupt myself mid-slide. Did I just blow through what I was supposed to do as a second break, or are we?
Yeah, a little bit, but that's okay. So if you want to take questions now, or do you want to finish and then take them all together? Whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I claim that's old age and infirm thinking rather than strategic behavior. But of course, that difference is exactly the point of this paper. So, okay. Yeah, let me finish. But for the life of me, I don't remember where. Oh, yes. Slide 17. Sorry, co-authors. No break by me at slide 17. Not even close. Too much enthusiasm, I suppose. All right, let me finish this slide, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So things are working great on the left side of this slide with regard to quality, in the sense, in all three senses. So first of all, actually, even in the baseline and also in the nudge, the treatment condition, there's a lot of agreement about what the efficient quality is. After all, that's a math problem. And so that's good. In 2.5 out of the 3 scenarios, they're agreeing on that. And so it's almost top coded, right? There's not that much room for improvement relative to the almost, whatever that is, 2.4 in the green bar here. Now, what there is room for improvement in, and where improvement does happen for quality, is in the next two aspects. So the first one is the seller willing to do what the seller thinks the agreement asks the seller to do? And the answer in the nudge condition is more often yes than it was in the baseline condition. Okay, and again, this is green and yellow. This is not lilac and rose. We are not disaggregating between endogenous principle-based Sunday night agreements and endogenous rule-based Sunday night agreements. We're just asking, if we remind these characters that the world's going to change, does it help? And the answer is, it does help a little bit. It helps in quality, not on shared understanding of what should be done. That's almost top-coded, but on commitment, if you want to hazard a different word here, the seller's willingness to do what the seller thinks the agreement calls upon the seller to do, and equilibration. Okay, so statistically higher for both of these. Now, in contrast, very important, price is fuzzier here because fairness is fuzzy, I think, is a reasonable way to summarize that. It isn't that the price actually delivered is fuzzy, that's 70 or 65 or 75 or whatever it is. But let's start here on the left of these three bars on the right half of the figure. They have a much lower shared understanding of what the agreement thinks the reasonable price is. And there's an insignificant increase in the buyer's willingness to actually pay that price. But there's actually an insignificant decrease in equilibration. Does the buyer do what the seller is expecting regarding price? And that does not improve with this little nudge. And so I'll show you one last picture, which is designed to say, this stuff on the right, this big opportunity to have clarified better what does the agreement specify about price, and to cause the same commitment or buy-in on the buyer's side to deliver on that agreement that we did see on the seller's side for quality, and thereby to increase equilibration on price that we did see for quality, didn't happen. So the nudge worked for quality, it didn't work for price. And to come back to highly endogenous data summarizing, this is within the nudge, throwing away the baseline data for a minute, all the dyads that achieved efficient equilibration on quality on the left side of that previous slide, and breaking out which ones, oh my, look at that, which ones achieved equilibration on price in the purple versus did not achieve equilibration on price in the blue. And that's the problem, right? On the previous slide, it's the failure to achieve equilibration on price that leads to the lack of an aggregate finding on total performance. Okay, apologies for getting carried away. Let me get out of here. We have a couple of summary slides, but we have also plenty of time.
And there was a lot of action in the chat around what happens on Sunday night. So you started off talking about Sunday night, but then you didn't tell us a lot about what happens on Sunday night and what around what is a rule, what is a principle, how you coded it. There was answers about the 3 arrays coded these things, but I think it's worth saying maybe a couple more words about this, because it's really what then drives the whole of what's happening later.
So I agree with everything except the last quarter of a sentence. And then I'm going to pass this to my co-authors since they are the ones who read all those questions in the chat. But the difference between a rule and a principle is what motivated us. It is what we did highly endogenously in looking at the original condition, the baseline condition, data collection in the lab. Of course, the nudge is a separate condition. And when we are comparing baseline to nudge, we're not even coding. We wouldn't necessarily, the coding of rules versus principles was to help us understand what was going on, and we viewed it as highly encouraging. But with that as an explanation, right? It's motivation. It's not analysis. It's not experiment. The experiment is baseline versus nudge.
But I think understanding what happens even in the nudge, what is happening at the nudge level, how is those principles formed? Because I think that's interesting, and it's related also to a question that Wouter asked, which is do principles maybe signal more trust? Are they more trusting? So what is going on even on the nudge level in the heads of these people is actually important.
Good. All right. Manuel, Holger, or Christian, having been engaged with that while I was blowing through my stop sign, does somebody have a take on what the questions are and what the answers are?
I can answer to Wouter Design's question maybe. So if I understand it correctly, or the way I understood it, you were asking whether principles are groups, people who agree on principles are more trusting, more trustworthy, right?
So I think the broad level would be is that in the first phase, I suspect that the 30% who agrees on principles, there's a selection effect there. I mean, I would like to understand why did that group choose principles, and it may be not the principles which make them perform better, but just that these are the people who chose principles and somehow they are smarter or more trusting. It was just one thought.
Yes, so we don't have, thank you, that's the way I understood it. We don't have data on whether they are trusting or more trusting or more trustworthy. So your specific question I cannot answer. And maybe Holger can chime in if I don't say everything, or fully say perfectly. So we did analyze a lot of characteristics that we gathered in post-experimental questionnaires and tried to get at these differences between the groups with principles and the groups without principles in the baseline. And we kind of didn't find the silver bullet there. We didn't find what it was.
Yes, so we also looked at a lot of characteristics. I think there were questions whether they were balanced in terms of all kinds of personal characteristics. I mean, our samples are not super large, but we didn't find anything that was meaningful in terms of showing clear differences. But maybe we didn't ask the right questions. It was a pretty complicated and long experiment, so we didn't go through a big battery of additional personality measurements, right? So, I mean, exposed, this might have been something that would be interesting, but it was a long and complicated experiment to start with. But
sorry to interrupt, Holger, just I mean, because I think it's a variant of the same question I asked. But is that statement true? Say you looked at the people who are nudged into into a different into forming principles or something. Did you induce people of certain characteristics that you could observe into agreements in a way that they look different from the baseline? So the idea might be that would be a way of using the nudge thing to try and say something about this unobserved heterogeneity. So the group who got the compliers, did the compliers look somehow different than
So we looked at that at various measures. All of the personnel, like the individual characteristics that we had, plus we tried to code the text to see whether the nudge had an impact on what they talk about, including things like trust, but there were very few mentions of that. And I think there is one or two dimensions where they slightly differ, but given the number of characteristics that we look at there and the size, we wouldn't want to overinterpret that. So there's really nothing that would be a clear indication in the measures that we have that would point to such a interpretable difference that I would be confident in stating that it's meaningful.
Christian, do you have a thought on this too? I have one last one, but if you have one.
Just one thing. I mean, the others mentioned it already, but there are obvious variables that one would have liked to have, like IQ. I think IQ would have been a fantastic measure here. People talked about, are these guys smarter? I think they are. The problem is we cannot show it. And we tried to infer things from the text that they have written, but that's actually very complicated and very noisy. So we don't have that data, unfortunately.
maybe Florian's tool that he mentioned in the chat will enlighten us a bit more, because if one reads it implicitly, one has the impression that maybe there is some trust element going on, but it's not written, and we've kind of focused very much on the written word, and there one doesn't see much of a difference.
All right, I may take out the first half of this talk the next time I give him. Let's be, I don't know, real world or managerial or something about this here, right? So I hear the interest in heterogeneous treatment effects, and I hear the interest in tailoring one's intervention if one thinks, you know, oh yes, division 1 is different from division 2. Let me, as the CEO, intervene differently in them. But surely it's simpler and of general interest if one has a positive effect from a intervention homogeneously applied, right? And that's what the nudge is. So it may be, I feel like we're distracting you by taking the encouragement that we took from the heterogeneous behaviors in the original data collection in the lab baseline condition. If you ask yourself, so what would you do homogeneously across the dyads whose heterogeneity you were going to have a hard time assessing? That's what the nudge is, right? And so, you know, Holger says our sample sizes aren't that big, but imagining that there's the same kind of heterogeneity here and there, we're asking, the simplest thing we could give you is a tool for applying across all the dyads that you know to be homogeneous and getting an effect on average, right? That's basically what putting a camera in the classroom is supposed to do, or whatever else. And so, you know, I would love to know what generated that heterogeneity in the baseline condition. I would love to know how to assess that and how to do different interventions depending on that assessment. But surely the first question is, can you do a homogeneous intervention that has an effect on average? And the answer is, we got partway there. So I don't know, maybe I'm drinking too much of somebody's Kool-Aid here. What else do we have? Some of this is on our concluding slides. And actually we have 6 minutes. Maybe I should do my 2 concluding slides if that's okay. Good. Okay. Yeah, so John's first question and Wouter and John's and other people's questions are meant to be addressed here. So, you know, in the baseline condition, absolutely, that's how we think of it. That quite possibly some pairs are each smarter. The two people are both smarter or more trusting, or maybe it only takes one and they explain it or persuade the other. But somehow, you know, quite possibly there's heterogeneity, omitted variables, and you might think that principles are irrelevant. However, the treatment effects on the seller being willing to do what the seller thinks the seller is called upon to do, and on the seller meeting the buyer's expectation of what the buyer thinks the seller is going to do, those two treatment effects in the slide 2 times ago suggest that no, principles, well, they show that the nudge is not irrelevant. And yeah, whether it's principles or not, that's a separate discussion, I agree. Another idea is, and we showed you that both the rules perform worse in the nudge than the baseline. That's an endogenous notion of which agreements are rules. And the principles perform worse in the nudge than in the baseline, as though perhaps sometimes in the baseline, what we coded as rules was perhaps a correct coding of what was in the chat and the agreement, but the parties may have had a more nuanced understanding in their heads of a principle. And so again, the treatment effects that I just mentioned are going against the idea that we're only picking up a relabeling with some previously high-performing rules now being further articulated and hence coded as principles. Also, in the general domain of lots of these questions is the idea that, you know, you've been talking about not all pairs of subjects are created equal. Relatedly, maybe not all principles are created equal. Maybe a confused pair wrote down a confused principle and people didn't think it was going to happen or weren't willing to act on their part of it or whatever else. And so we have a number of personal characteristics. They have no effect on performance or on principles. Another measure that it didn't occur to us until later to look at is how long did it take them to figure out phase one, the simple game, the 5 periods game. And the longer it took them to reach an agreement about phase one, the worse they performed. And the nudge actually causes people to take longer to figure out phase one. We also had an exit questionnaire where we said, among other things, was your agreement clear? And when the answer was yes, that was correlated with higher performance. And in the nudge, there were more instances of people saying it wasn't clear. And so again, in our pretty simple laboratory setting, our maybe too simple nudge wasn't good enough. It worked on quality and it didn't work on price. And in our setting, it's price that's fuzzy because fairness is fuzzy and efficiency isn't. Efficiency is a math problem. Okay, whoops, there we go. The concluding slide. So in the baseline, not very many principles and they did great. They had better shared understanding and better performance. In the nudge, we got significant treatment effects on quality, but couldn't get them to improve their collective behaviors and beliefs on price. And so at the end of the day, if this nudge had gotten it done, there's a sense in which we probably would have concluded that we gave too strong a nudge relative to the only slightly complicated environment we had. Because in the world, if these relational contracts are going to be a source of competitive advantage, they better be hard to copy. And apparently they're hard to copy here, at least relative to the nudge that we tried. All right, maybe even 2 minutes early. Again, apologies for blowing through a stop sign.
That was perfect, thank you. So one comment that came up also in the again, it goes back to how do we interpret these what's going on. Could the nudge, the treatment in the second part, be a coordination device, right? Could it serve as a coordination device and you would have wanted to try out a rule nudge just to compare whether it's about one or the, I mean, always exposed you want to, there's all these things you would have liked to do, but I thought that was an interesting suggestion.
To the extent that these are things related to the chat, it seems efficient for Manuel, Holger, and Christian to talk about them since they've been thinking about them.
Yeah, I can answer that one quickly. It's an interesting suggestion, one we didn't actually discuss. So we did enter this, with the idea that it's principles we want to see. So we thought about how to create principles. I understood this as a very good suggestion for a placebo treatment. I cannot answer it at the moment. We don't have the data. One piece of information maybe is that almost all groups in the baseline actually came up with some kind of a rule. Maybe not a very good rule sometimes, but they did figure out they have to talk about these numeric variables. And therefore, at least on that dimension, I wouldn't expect that notching that would lead to we kind of have a ceiling effect there already in the number of rule agreements that we see.
Great. Maybe to add one thing, so it's not so easy to think about what a coordination device is. Maybe to what extent the nudge can be a coordination device, or what it means to be a coordination device in the setting, right? Because they don't really know the game parameters. It's not that they have mapped out the game and they can sort of figure out the multiple equilibria and want to help them to coordinate on the efficient one, right? So it's a complex problem where they sort of don't know exactly the parameters of the game, but have to sort of find shared agreement nonetheless on what to do. So yeah, it's interesting, but it's hard to think about what a coordination device exactly is in this setting. So I think I would have to think about this for a while.
So we have another 15 minutes. Anybody who wants to jump in and ask questions, please go ahead. If it gets messy, I'll put some order, but if not, just unmute yourself and ask.
Maria, my understanding from our previous versions before the summer was that these 15 minutes are they're extra optional.
Extra
right?
optional.
This is
yeah.
for people who
So,
want to hang around.
Who want to
And,
hang out, absolutely.
you know, we already know that you can depart a Zoom anytime, but those who need or want to go should take off, and anybody who has thoughts or
you have Bob's blessing to go. So I do have a question though. It goes back to what was being discussed before, because you started off motivating this as credibility versus clarity, right? And then it says, okay, let's investigate clarity. But then it goes back to Wouter's question too. We go back and say, well, how do we know this is about clarity? That they're not interpreting, it's easier to trust what the other person's doing in these principles. Designing these principles tells me something about the other person that means they're more trustworthy, or maybe principles, because they're more adaptable, I can trust more. So yeah, that's why I am also of the mindset that knowing what happens in these conversations, which is knowing the conversation of Sunday night. What's great about this is that you have the Sunday night conversations on your computers. You can read them, you can interpret them, and then that's where I also think that this is fascinating. But then it's what happens. How do we? So I fully agree with the point. Oh, this is a nudge. It's random. It works in this way. We have a treatment effect, whatever. But this is all about what's happening, what beliefs, and how people's minds are changing. I also found interesting. You said that the quality changes. There's just something about maybe this is signaling commitment, and commitment starts feeling a bit like trust and how do I expect the other person? So anyway. It's more general question.
Let me take a whack at that, and others can chime in. So, first of all, it's entirely possible that I have the words that Rebecca Henderson and I decided that we liked too firmly in my head, and they should go away. So let me back up. As you said, I don't know very many experiments. That's a weak statement. I don't know very many experiments, period. But I don't know very many experiments that have Sunday night. And I don't know any models that have Sunday night. Mm-hmm. And I am desperate to do a nudge of this community to start empiricists and theorists thinking about Sunday night, right? Especially when the literature is getting richer and richer in terms of learning and adaptation, all of which we perfectly understand. It's as though we check into our hotels on Sunday night. We do not go to the bar. Sometime when we're asleep, God slips a strategy pair under your door and a strategy pair under mine over coffee in your room. Now that they have an espresso machine in your room, you check the incentive compatibility of those strategies on Monday morning. If they work, bang, you go to the office, and at 9 o'clock we start our equilibrium, right? And so that notion is wrong about whether people actually do Sunday night, and it doesn't ever get us the sentence I'm really desperate for. I want somebody in one of these experiments or models to have in their head at a difficult moment, did we miscommunicate, or am I being gamed? And actually, neither of those happens in equilibrium, but certainly not So, whether it's clarity or credibility, it's trying to build an equilibrium. And so if it evokes commitment or trust or anything, just could we please start studying building an equilibrium? And which of these it is probably needs lots of sorting out.
Any other questions, comments, reactions?
I guess I'll jump in since there's not a lot. So super interesting. It seems here like whether sort of underlying this idea that principles are better than rules in the situation, for the situation you set up, that seems right. That seems to be dependent a lot on what sort of shocks you're facing. So I can imagine very large sort of fundamental uncertainty. Maybe you're better off with a rule, right? And so it seems like right, that you had a very sort of narrow set of things that could happen, and maybe so before we get too excited about just having principles all the time.
No, great. And again, I'll just take all the blame for leading us all down a particular garden path with the over detailed and over interpreted analysis of the baseline condition. That said, I couldn't agree more, right? So if you read between the lines of David Krebs's corporate culture paper, I think you see the idea similar to what Eric's saying and similar to, you know, the Fed and so on for different reasons, not Milton Friedman's reasons quite, but you see the point that bright lines are good for monitoring and bad for adaptation. So it's easier to know that I reneged if I promised to do a price of 70. Of course, you know, if the world shocks enough such that 70 is no longer incentive compatible, yeah, you're going to cleanly monitor that I reneged, and it's obvious that I will renege, right? So there's some tension between monitoring and adaptation here. And we're tilted towards adaptation because price and quality are just numbers here. When in the world, you know, did your last co-author work hard enough on your project? Well, guess what? That's not a number. And now we have monitoring issues. Other thoughts?
So I had a question for Christian Zehnder. I just typed it in the chat, but I remember Christian working with Oliver for some time and doing some great experiments. And they had some of the same flavor, that they kind of looked at the benefits of having kind of rigid rules, which then avoided the shading. So I was wondering, is there any link here? To me, it feels like, you know, the shading, is there any evidence we see shading, or I should really try to read this paper and forget about Oliver and your work?
Boy, I wish you asked me that question, but go ahead, Christian.
You can add whatever you like at the end. I think there's a very strong relation between these two things. I mean, as you all know, Oliver doesn't like repeated games too much. So in the experiments that I do with Oliver, it's typically a one-shot situation where you have the conflict directly in the situation in this one period game. So there's punishment and such things going on. But the basic idea is exactly what we do here as well. We try to find ways so the parties interact with each other without getting into trouble. Here, it happens over time. In the work with Oliver, it happens within the same period. But for me, the basic idea behind it is very similar. And if you look at Oliver's new work with David, they talk about things such as guiding principles, you know, things as loyalty, equity. And these are obviously also things that we care about in this project, because these principles, they include exactly these issues. And if you heard Bob talking about the problem to find an agreement for price, this is related to these, you know, guiding principles such as equity, because there is a fuzziness in the fairness norm that you want to apply here, because several things are possible, given that there's an outside option after the shock and things like that. So yeah, these things are very related, and you shouldn't forget about either part of the work. They're both important and they fit together somewhere.
So just 45 seconds of echoing that. I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm telling you a story. So the story is, and some of you, I think, were probably there, you know, in what year is Hart Holmstrom, QJE, 2010 or something, right? So let's suppose they were giving it in the MIT org seminar in 2008, and they split it. And Oliver gave the first half, and then Bengt gets up to give the second half, and his first words are, "Of course, this is all a reduced form for a repeated game." And Oliver goes slightly unhappy and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so why am I telling you a story? So I think stories happen on Sunday night. I think we need a lot more work on what do parties do when they can't fully articulate strategies. And so I think then checking, you know, okay, does your subsequent behavior accord with what I understood the implications of the story to be, and so on. But yeah, I'm looking for a role for stories on Sunday night here, and so what happens, to directly answer your question, of course, is shading in a static model is a Pareto inefficient continuation equilibrium in a repeated game, and that's what we see. We have 4 minutes. Then we must quit.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? Go ahead.
So, Bob, I would hope very much that the next time you give this paper, you do keep the baseline treatment in. You didn't tell us precisely what the instructions were to the participants about what an agreement was supposed to be, but I think the baseline treatment is people operating naturally, and it's extremely interesting to see the correlation between the rule, principle, classification, and the performance. Playing devil's advocate, part of me feels that there's a bit of an experimenter demand effect in your nudge treatment. You guys have been thinking a lot about clarity, and you're kind of pushing them to be very clear in their agreement. And so part of me feels that the nudge treatment is slightly more artificial than the baseline treatment. Of course, as I tried to say, I didn't see the words used in the baseline treatment. You did show us the words used in the nudge treatment, but part of me is just slightly worrying that you're pushing them towards clarity at the potential expense of credibility.
So, I don't think it's there anymore, although I haven't been in my office for several months, but I remember, Christian will remember, we scribbled on the smaller of my two whiteboards, and the bottom line that we reached was, there's an intellectual difference and a managerial difference between, on the one hand, trying to get exogenous variation in principles to see if principles really matter compared to rules, versus on the other, trying to have an intervention that does something. And for the former, I'm all with you about demand effects. For the latter, if we find a next one that works, I actually don't care. A demand effect is just fine. And yeah, code me as, I don't have a banner like the one behind me that says econ department rather than management school, but this is the appropriate banner today, so.
Great. So
thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
appreciated.
much.
Can't wait to read the
thanks,
chat.
Bob. And we have another seminar a month from now. So we'll hope to see you all then. And thanks all for participating. And thanks, Bob and co-authors.
Thank you, Maria.
Bye.
Bob?
Yes?
It's Meg again. Your data where you showed that the comparison between the pool data for the baseline versus the nudge and the disaggregated data for rules versus principles, where if you look at the pool data, the nudge did better, but when you disaggregated into rules and principles, the nudge did worse than the baseline. That's a classic example of Simpson's paradox. You explained it extremely well, but
now I have a label.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very nice to see you.
Great to see you. Bye, Florian.
Yeah, we should just draw a little network diagram of co-authorships or whatever.
I was doing that already, yeah.
Or offices.
That's right. Thanks for the experimental demand comment. That's actually, we talked about this a lot. So whether we have an experimental demand, and then we realized we are using experimental demand as a treatment because we actually want to induce them to write down those principles. And we do this by having a very strong experimental demand effect so that they actually do this. But that's not what we are ultimately interested in. But then we take the next step and want to see how they perform with this. So that's
right. I guess what I was trying to distinguish between was exactly what it is that you're inducing, if there is an experimental demand effect, exactly what it is you're inducing them to focus on. And my concern was that you might be inducing them to over-focus on clarity relative to credibility. Not that you're inducing them to spend more time on the agreement, but inducing them potentially to distort the, but I'm just speaking off the top of my head because I didn't see your instructions in the baseline, and I haven't, they passed very quickly on the slides, but that was my concern.
Holger, since we're down to only 11 people, let me embarrass Meg and tell you that we've known each other for 40 years, and over time I've gotten to the place where if I think I disagree with her, it means I didn't understand her. So, just get used to it. So.
Actually, if I may just add something, that's actually very interesting, the point you're saying. And we do have some very, very preliminary evidence on that. So we went after the idea that people were kind of, the nudge may have crowded out for talking about other stuff, like, promise making and building trust. So basically the credibility part. Yeah, and there is sometimes it goes a little bit in that direction, and I can tell you the way. So the formulations that we used were basically in the baseline. We just told them, you chat, and the goal is to come up with a written statement in which you can describe how you and the buyer make their decisions in this study. So I believe we were very neutral there. And in the nudge treatment, it was what Bob showed on the slide. So we did give them more to think about, and they were clearly thinking more about this, second phase and trying to come up with that. And that may have been at the expense a little bit of building credibility, building trust.
I also think that, our experiment is slightly biased in that regard, because the baseline game, so the initial game with which they start, is super simple. So they even get that one right if they talk too much about, the change and what's going to happen in the future. I think in reality, this point is probably much more important than in our experiment, because there may be a much bigger trade-off if the situation that you're dealing with currently is a bit more complicated, because then you may actually already screw up the first phase before the shock even happens. And it might be worse than anything else. So this trade-off is something that our environment doesn't capture, because I think the initial game is too simple for that. But that's a super interesting point that one could explore further.
Thank you, Meg. As always, I in this Zoom era, I have to go log into a class at Princeton, believe it or not. But,
okay.
I'm
nice
gonna.
to see you, Bob. That was great.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. We'll catch up.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.